Hey guys, Brian here from Starlite Pulp. Welcome in. Thanks for taking a look today. And today on the show we've got Mr. Terrance Layhew, and he is not only the host of the Suit Up podcast. Some of you will know him from that for sure. But we're also here today to talk about his new book called One Man's Treasure by Terrance. And so, Terrance, how you doing today, man?
I am living the dream.
Absolutely. So yeah, let's talk One Man's Treasure. This is it's a bit of a throwback in a lot of ways, a little bit of a
hmm
swashbuckling novel,
hmm
and it's got everything from sailing the Caribbean to islands to swordplay to sibling rivalry to romance to everything in between. So for all our listeners out there, give them what you would consider an elevator pitch.
One Man's Treasure is the story of two brothers. One of them wins the ancient treasure map in a poker game. High stakes, of course, because what else does Dixon Hastings play? And the other brother thinks this could actually be real. And so he convinces him, hey, let's go see if we can figure it out. Along the way, they encounter Dix's spurned lover and modern day pirates, which that's the gist of the story. And do they find the treasure, or do they discover that friendships are the real treasure?
Right. Excellent. And I know that you played around a little bit with the old indie theme in here too, right? Of how
hmm
that in that one class he's talking, and it's the remember that X never
Yeah.
ever marks the spot. Was that purposeful?
Yes. I think that you can't just have, like, this is the problem with treasure maps. Like, when you sit down and start working on it, how are you really going to make it interesting if all they have is literally this is where it ends up? One of my favorite treasure hunting stories is like the first one, Treasure Island. Before then, there was no idea of pirates burying gold, with the exception of like one person. It's like Captain Kidd's treasure or something like that, is the
Hmm.
only actual hidden treasure. Everyone else's is complete bull. And so creating different complications along the way to get to the treasure ends up becoming the story.
Excellent. That's funny too, because I actually have a nonfiction book somewhere. It's probably in here over here, but it's on the Captain Kidd treasure. I haven't read it yet, but I guess I should. But yeah, it's funny how it's funny how myths become legend, and then all of a
hmm
sudden, we assume that every pirate went around just stashing their treasure on random islands. And then of course, Pirates of the Caribbean and things like that don't help.
Yeah. Well, and that's really what I wanted to try doing, was build the backstory and make that the idea of the pirate's treasure matters more than the pirate's treasure itself.
Sure.
When the modern day pirates show up, and of course they find out there's a treasure map, it doesn't matter that they could make more money in the ransom. They want the actual treasure because buried treasure just has this immediate effect on people
It does.
where it's the idea. And that's what I want to start with from the very beginning of the book
Sure.
is the one brother when he pitches, Sam is the younger brother, when he pitches
Mhm.
to Dix, we can go after this treasure. He's like, it's not because this is actually treasure. It's because this is a gamble.
Sure.
Because there might not be treasure, but what if there is?
Well, and I think that there's always an appeal towards, well, at least for a lot of people, towards it's kind of a get rich quick kind of concept,
hmm
right?
hmm
There's the adventure to it for sure, but and the gamble, like you said, but at the same time, if it pans out,
It's
woo,
worth it.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a fun concept for sure. So I saw you mention, and I think anyways, you were talking about the sibling rivalry in here,
hmm
and you mentioned I think your own brother at one point.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in the acknowledgments, I
Is his
comment that
name Tristan?
his name is Tristan. Yep.
That's my son's name too. So
Oh, hey,
excellent.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, talk about Tristan a little bit.
My brother and I are like the real, not necessarily the real life versions of Dixon and
Hmm.
Sam Hastings, but that kind of dynamic where he's far more of the personable, nice, anyone will love him. I
Hmm.
am the slightly more methodical, quiet, amoral of the siblings. And
Hmm.
so there is a degree of the dynamic between the impulsivity
Sure.
and the, well, let's think about this, that growing up with my brother, I knew all the time. The
Right.
back and forth, it's like that meme. I'm not sure if you've seen it. That's like people, writers without siblings, your sibling walks through the door, your sister walks through the door, and you're like, oh, hello, my beloved sister. When it's a writer who has siblings, the response is like, greetings, whore. Like,
Right.
it's just, there is a genuine difference. When you have siblings, you have a different dynamic
Hmm.
with siblings than you do anyone else.
Right.
And like, I remember working with my brother at one point, and he and I walk in the same room. I'm giving someone a tour of the
Yeah.
facility, and the guys, we instantly start biting into each other. And the poor like dude that was following me thinks that I'm just demeaning this poor employee and just like verbally abusing him. And I'm like, no, 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 that's my brother. It's fine.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. You can definitely get away with a lot more with family in that kind of situation than you can with even friends to some degree, but certainly acquaintances or coworkers or something like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, for
So there's a
sure.
lot of moments where between Dixon and Sam, just Dixon will 100% call him completely out and say, I don't care about what your feelings are.
Hmm.
I'm right. You are wrong. Deal with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so does well, obviously Tristan knows about the book, but
Yes.
is he good with his the way he comes out in it?
He has not yet read it.
Ah,
I
okay.
do think that to the extent that he knows, he's mildly amused. I think especially from the standpoint that my brother is definitely a has been more of a Lothario in his time, and I definitely enjoyed teasing him a little bit about that in the book.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that.
So I
Okay,
think that
so
he appreciates it. Good characterization.
okay. Yeah, good. So talk to me a little bit about because in the book we have foreign ports of call and we have
Hmm.
pirates and we have, they're on a ship and obviously in the Caribbean, right?
Hmm.
Uh what kind of research did you have to do on that? Like are you familiar with ships, with sailing, with that kind of thing, or was this all stuff you had to look up and do research on in the Caribbean? Have you been there? All that kind of
Hmm.
stuff.
I haven't been to the Caribbean. I've been to Mexico, in Huatuco,
Hmm.
in Oaxaca. So I have a general, and I grew up by the beach. Like I grew up in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which is beautiful resort area for Chicagoland people. So I've grown up around water,
Got it.
boats,
Yeah.
and sand.
Mhm.
Which really, do you need to know more than that? But the thing that I spent the most amount of time researching was the actual ship, because
Sure.
trying to figure out the movements of characters
Hmm.
throughout it, especially when it like this, you start increasing the tension and pressure. Knowing where characters are in relation to each other matters. So that was the thing I spent the most amount of time. I watched YouTube videos, I read articles, just what do luxury yachts look like?
Right, right, right.
Where are the things? And ultimately, as far as the desert island, I just looked up details. What are
Hmm.
common facts of desert islands? I think the one thing that I spent the most amount of time with the island researching were flash storms and specifically sinkholes. Like at first I was like, "Oh, quicksand. We're gonna throw that in
Hmm.
there," and I went,
Hmm.
"No, really, it's a little hard. Just make it like fell in a hole."
Hmm. Hmm. And so what you're telling me then is you don't have a whole lot of experience with luxury yachts. Is that
Tragically, no. I would love to get experience on luxury yachts though. So if any of you watching, listening, I have long since said, if you need an interesting person at your party, Great Gatsby style, I am here for you. I will be the most interesting man in the room. I will make up anything. I will be your interesting guest. Just like pay for my passage there,
especially if
preferably
it's on
first
a luxury
class.
yacht?
Yes, and I'll do it.
Outstanding. So where did the idea for One Man's Treasure come from?
Really, I think that the genesis of it came very quickly. I loved the idea of he won a ancient treasure map in a poker game, and what would happen after that. And once I had the idea it was two brothers, it kind of just spun out from there. But where did the map come from? Like one step forward, one step back. Where did the map come from? Addressing any complications as far as that went. And then what would happen if you actually tried getting treasure? Because I had seen that it's not Jupiter Ascending, it's like Jupiter's Legacy on
Hmm.
Netflix.
Hmm.
And it's a show I feel very conflicted about because I really hate everything that's like the superhero element,
Yeah.
but I loved all of it's the 1930s and they're going adventuring on this like Skull Island type place.
Interesting.
And I thought, how do you like realistically? I
Hmm.
love Clive Cussler stuff,
Hmm.
but my issue is it becomes more like techno thriller at a certain point because you have this technology to help you
Right.
discover the treasure.
Right.
But I also don't like to write period very much. So I'd rather try to figure out how do you, it's more interesting to say, put modern day guys on a desert island and strip away the technology
Sure.
because they don't know how to use it and it doesn't work. And
Right.
then they have to figure things out.
Sure. And I got to be honest, I write mostly period stuff.
Hmm.
I mean, not yeah, probably about
Hmm.
80% now that I think about it. But if I were to write something modern, it would be like that because
Hmm.
that's the last thing I want to deal with is,
Yeah.
your cell phone coverage and what apps need to work for this to open. And that's that's that for me personally, I don't know about the reader, but for
Hmm.
me personally, that takes me away from what I'm
Hmm.
trying to do, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I like the idea of stranding a bunch of Gen Z folks on an island with no technology.
It makes for a more entertaining story because then you naturally have more complications. You have more conflict
Mhm.
simply through the nature of these are people that are reliant on a specific thing.
Mhm.
Then it forces them to dig inside more, which
Well,
in the
sure.
case of like, go ahead.
And the interesting aspect of that is that, like if you said it in the 1930s or 40s,
Hmm.
there would be a competency there
Yes.
that doesn't exist with what you're
Hmm.
talking about because they didn't
Hmm.
have any of those little cheat codes to help them along all the way. So they actually had to know how to do things.
Hmm.
They couldn't just look it up on YouTube whenever they wanted to figure out how to do it. And so, but Gen Z, and this isn't a knock on Gen Z either, by the way. It would be any generation that has just
Yeah.
simply grown up with smartphones. I'm not knocking them in
Hmm.
particular. My son is a Gen Z kid and he's great, but I mean it's the the overall know-how, right,
Hmm.
would be completely different in the
But
30s versus the 50s versus the
yeah,
70s versus now, right?
which though that's part of the reason why I chose professions of the characters a little specifically. Sam is an engineer. That means that he actually can figure out looking at a piece of machinery in theory, depending on what his engineering
Sure,
background is.
sure.
And Dixon is a lawyer. And I had watched Suits religiously at that point. So I wrote this book like 2 years ago. And this was before it like blasted off on Netflix. In hindsight, if I had known it would be as successful as it was, I would
Hmm.
have put more Suits references in. But I made him a lawyer because it being a lawyer means you are an expert at soft skills
Hmm.
virtually. You know how to negotiate, you know how to talk to people, you know how to kind of
Argue.
try strong arming and arguing your way, which is something that I try to utilize throughout the book as situations come up before it escalates to fighting.
Hmm.
Usually, like unlike a Jack Reacher novel where immediately Reacher's solution is you just need to use more brute force,
Hmm.
Dixon tries using persuasion first
Sure,
and arguing his case first, and
sure,
then try escalating things from there.
sure. Well, and that's the thing. I mean, any lawyer is going to be not necessarily an expert, but adept at
Hmm.
with rhetoric, right?
Yes. Hmm.
And rhetoric literally is the art of argument. I mean, that's the definition of it. And so they're always going to have a slight advantage in that sense.
Hmm.
Um, Probably not over their own spouses. Uh,
No, no, never, never. That's not
but
how that works.
but otherwise, they're always going to have that advantage. So yeah, I like that you threw that in because, like you said, both an engineer and a lawyer would my point is if this
Hmm.
were if Dixon and Sam were a construction worker
Oh
and
yeah.
and a teacher, it would be very different.
But I think that that's what makes the choices we make for how who characters are interesting because it allows their skill sets to shine one way or another. Because even though Sam's an engineer, you'd think that means he's methodical. He's not in the slightest.
Hmm.
And in fact, I even think I make a point in the book that he can look at a blueprint and figure things out and enjoys tinkering with the machine. The moment it comes to real life, trying to do that, zero planning at all.
Right.
In one of the reviews, I think it was the book Graveyard, he made a comment that he was a little surprised at having like not working class heroes
Hmm.
because these are upper white collar
Hmm.
professions, kind
Hmm.
of. And he made a comment that really this actually makes it more throwback-ish because that's the type of adventure hero you used to have. And I'll be honest, that wasn't a intentional decision,
Sure.
but it fits. It fits well.
It does. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so funny. I was just thinking of this earlier, and I'm sure there have been far smarter people than me that have talked about this, but I just think it's so funny how I keep thinking in my head as I'm thinking about the book, and they're in the Caribbean, and
Hmm.
the Caribbean scene, an island in the Caribbean, and then you talk about Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's Caribbean. And what is that? Like, why is it not just Pirates of the Caribbean? Like, why do we put the emphasis on the B all of a sudden with Disney, but with nothing else? I don't understand. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like I'm thinking of the Caribbean, vacationing in the Caribbean, islands in
Hmm.
the Caribbean, and then Jack Sparrow is Caribbean.
This is a very valid point.
I just don't get it.
The nuances of the English language and pronunciation never cease to amaze me. I will confess I have been mispronouncing the word diaper for years. To this day, I think it's actually correctly diaper,
Mhm.
but I've always said it diaper. And I thought this was I was the English pronunciation or something. No, 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 no. I call my mother up after my wife and I have a long like back and forth who's right on this, and
Mhm.
it's simply that I'm from originally Wisconsin, and despite not having a lot of Wisconsinisms, that's the one I
Yeah.
don't get it. I
Yeah.
haven't worn one in like 30 years, so
Right.
it's even more confusing.
Right. Yeah. Well, and like you said, the English language is such a mess. I mean, man, it is just
Have
crazy.
you have you read there was a there occasionally I'll get like one of those great courses on Audible, and they had one on the English language.
Hmm.
And it is just fascinating to see how from Middle English
Hmm.
we developed into Elizabethan English and then eventually to our current English. Just
Hmm.
realizing how adaptive this language has been
Hmm.
is the reason why it's proliferated the way that it has.
Sure. Yeah, and so my most famous, not famous, that's not the right word, but my most infamous, I guess, mispronunciation for a long time, right, uh was Goethe, right?
Mm,
Because
mhm.
I thought for the longest time, I was literally at Berkeley, and I'm reading this book, and we go into the class, and I'm thinking the author's name is Goethe because that's what it looks like, right? I'm like, I don't know any better. Here I am at Berkeley. I'm in some literature review, and all of a sudden they start talking about Goethe. And I'm like, did I read the wrong book? Like, what's going on here? Who's this Goethe dude? And then all of a sudden I realize, oh, gotcha, German, not Goth. Okay, but
Mhm.
I still don't know where the R is in there. But still, it's and that was it's just funny because we're writers and people just think all the time and speakers and everything else. So people think all the time that you somehow have some cheat code to how to pronounce things, and no, it's trial and error. You got to figure it out.
Yeah, and usually it comes in the form of very like for the longest time I thought Ian was Ian
Hmm.
because you read it and I didn't know any Ians growing up.
Right.
And then all of a sudden it's like, oh.
Hmm. Hmm.
Or if
Yeah,
it's an
no.
audiobook, for years I'd listen to something and know what it sounded like, but not be able to spell it.
Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, that happened to me the first time I ever saw because I grew up with a few Jeffs, but it was always
Hmm.
Jeff or Jeffrey.
Oh,
And then I saw Geoff and I was like, what is
hmm.
that name? And then I realized it's just Jeff. And it's like, okay.
This is Geoff, my friend.
My friend Geoff. Okay. So first off, you have now written, what do you want
Hmm.
me to call this? A thriller? Action
I call
adventure
it an
slash puzzle?
adventure, an
Adventure. Okay.
adventure story.
So you have an adventure book under your belt, and you also have a couple, or at least one, right? Romantic,
Two.
or you refer to it as a
I've
rom-com.
got two
Two.
rom-coms.
Okay.
Yep.
So two rom-coms out. So two rom-coms and now an adventure novel, which also includes some,
Hmm.
romantic elements in it.
My mom read it and was like, "Why did you write another romance novel?" I'm like, "No, no, no, it's an adventure story." She's like, "Yeah, what is it?" Like, better cover.
That's funny. Um, but obviously a lot of us writers have a certain amount of versatility, but at the same time,
Hmm.
I think that there's almost always for just about everybody, there might be a few exceptions. Joe Lansdale might be one and a couple of others, but I think for most writers, there's kind of a sweet spot, right? Where
Hmm.
this is where I feel most comfortable, in
Yes.
this genre doing this. Even if I branch out and I write, something over here and something over here, it's like in the back of your head, it's like, well, I still got to get back to that sweet spot at some point, right? Uh, and so with you, obviously, you've done the adventure novel, and then you have the rom-coms. What gives you the confidence, I guess, to feel like you can jump genres like that and kind of, code switch, if you will, with regards to how the story comes about, the language, things like that?
I think it has to do with character, first and foremost. I think
Okay.
that all stories are really just delineations of the same type of thing. There's a great book I read recently called, I say recently, like I've read it 2 weeks ago. It's actually like 2 years ago.
Uh-huh.
The Anatomy of Genre by John Truby. And I think it's interesting because he gives it basically like a wheel chart. You move up and down these certain value chains based on what kind of genre it is. And I think at the end of the day, it all depends on like, for me, the sweet spot's the characters. If I can enjoy the character
Mhm.
and I can give good dialogue back and forth, I can write just about any genre, I think. The thing is, I don't really like all genres, is what I've learned the more that I write. Or at least I don't like writing genre convention. I'd rather focus on trying to write interesting characters back and forth in a situation rather than. So it's like take a sitcom and move it into a different environment,
Right. I I
is kind of my genre idea.
I completely understand that because, I've said this a number of times, but some of my favorite stories that not only that I've written, but also that we publish here,
Hmm.
are hybrids, right?
Hmm.
Where
Yep.
it's set in the West,
Hmm.
but it could very easily be a sci-fi story, or
Yep.
or it's a sci-fi story, but like say, for example, The Mandalorian, right? The
Yes.
Mandalorian
Perfect example.
Mandalorian is a Western. It's a Western.
Yes.
Like
Hmm.
it's
Western with laser guns.
yeah, it's even on a planet that looks like the Old West for goodness sakes. So I mean, there are those genre benders, if you will,
Hmm.
are some of my favorites for sure. And we've published a bunch of them. Now the problem, Terrence, is that it becomes very difficult for those things to win awards. That's the hard part,
Mm.
is that to
Hmm.
get them recognized is difficult because if you are, looking at the best American mystery stories or something like that, they want mysteries. They
Hmm.
don't want a mystery set in space. They want
Yep.
mysteries,
Hmm.
traditional mysteries. If you send it to sci-fi, they might say, "Yeah, but this is more of a
This is
mystery."
more of mystery. Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute, So it does become very difficult with regards to that, but so what? It's
Hmm.
there's so much.
Awards are awards. At the end of the day, for me at least, and this is where a lot of my decisions writing come from, and what I always have to try working my way back towards. Every time I think I need to write something that's really commercial, I start spinning a little bit because I don't want to write something that's really commercial.
Hmm.
I want to write something that I find interesting.
Exactly.
And I find writing a retro adventure story that's set in the modern day with heavy romantic elements
Well,
interesting.
and funny enough, Terrence, being an independent author,
Hmm.
um, has its advantages like that,
Hmm.
because if you are a Clive Cussler, who you mentioned, or a James Lee Burke, or a John Sanford, one of those guys that literally pumps out a book a year, just bam, 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 bam. You come to your agent slash
Hmm.
publisher, editor, and say, hey, for this one, I want to do something totally different. They're going to look at you and go, yeah, no. I mean, because they have you under contract for the expectations of what they want from you,
Hmm.
So for James Lee Burke, it's another Hackberry Holland novel, or another Dave Robichaux novel, which I love. That's not the issue. It's just, for then he'll write something like White Doves at Morning, or The Jealous Kind, or something like that, and he had to write like 25 of those other novels in order
Hmm.
for that to get them to do one of this other one. And so we have the advantage, with Starlite as a publisher, and you as an
Hmm.
independent author. We have the advantage to just be like, you know what, I'm going to write what the
Hmm.
hell I want to write, and I'm not going to worry about what my publisher says the market wants, which is a good thing.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's something that it's a weird advantage, because obviously we have so many disadvantages in that, but the flexibility that we have is actually pretty nice. So
Hmm.
we.
It's being able to be more creative in a lot of senses.
Mhm,
And that's one of the things that I really enjoy, down to being able to do things like I know that you enjoy this too, picking out what is the best cover that fits this type of story, or
mhm.
how do I imagine the way that the narrative is structured, just being able to make more of those decisions.
Yeah. And by the way, so I want to get into that for just a second, because you said that you've realized over time that that there are some genres that you're just not a big fan of, right?
Hmm.
What would, in a hierarchical sense, what would be the ones that you really kind of enjoy?
Hierarchical sense, my favorite genre, if I look at like what I have behind me, just as an example,
Mhm.
it is definitely mystery, crime and mystery kind of start interweaving, but somewhere in that zone. Then we get to espionage, and then we get to what's sad is the more I realize that's basically it. I do enjoy some other novels. I've enjoyed a handful of romance novels, honestly.
Mhm.
I sometimes think that they do great inter-character play if they're really cleverly well written.
Mhm.
But that's about the extent of it. I don't read a lot of science fiction. I
Mhm.
read some science fiction, but not a lot.
Yeah,
Again, it's just not quite my bag.
you probably read the ones in the review.
Yes, I
That's probably
do.
it.
Although, and that's actually the interesting thing. When I read the review, I usually pick out these are like my top three. And
Mhm.
sometimes those top three are very not the genres that I typically choose to read, but I
Right.
think that they were exceptional stories.
Yeah, 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 exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No, and
I also really don't like fantasy, but there's one I love. Terry Mancore on Suit Up podcast a couple of times. Fascinating, just the world building that he does. I
Mhm.
read those.
Mhm. Yeah, you know, fantasy for me is one of those things, honestly, man, because weirdly, we don't get much fantasy. We do get some sci-fi that
Hmm.
will lend itself towards fantasy,
Hmm.
but it would still probably be sci-fi in my mind. We've never, I don't think anyway, as I recollect, I'm not sure we've ever gotten just a straight up like elves and orcs kind of
No.
fantasy story like that. But I'm like you. I'm always impressed with what they can do as a fantasy
Hmm.
writer. Like I was a
I
huge
find
Tolkien nerd.
Tolkien fascinating from
Right,
a literary
absolutely.
perspective. I
And
can't make
Tolkien
it through
is
the
fascinating.
Fellowship.
I mean, dude came up with whole languages and
Hmm.
songs that didn't
Hmm.
exist for species that didn't exist, and then wrote thousand-page books about them. I mean, the attention to detail and the amount of creativity and research to some degree that
Hmm.
you have to do something like that is dumbfounding to me.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I don't necessarily love it from a literature standpoint.
Well,
I just
even for
find it
me,
fascinating.
like I'm working on in little bits here and there. I'm trying to write something in period. I am discovering I don't like writing in period because I don't like to, I start feeling like I'm hung up on the conventions of language. Because especially if you start dipping farther and farther back into the past, like we were talking about older English,
Yeah,
it's hard for me to get out of my head that it's supposed to sound differently than you write.
right.
Also, the amount of detail that it feels like, ugh, that's the reason I prefer writing in the present and just finding a way of negating whatever I don't like about the modern.
Sure. And I had we talked about this briefly on the last podcast, but it's actually not out yet, so nobody's seen that. But we were talking about language, using language in period, and it
Hmm.
is interesting because um, you want to be accurate to the point that you're not brutally inaccurate, right?
Hmm.
Because you don't want it to look like a big wowzer mistake. But at the same
Hmm.
time, I had a gentleman a while back write me a very, very long, very nice email about Trunk Full of Zeros and Outlaw
Hmm.
Ballads. And they were very complimentary overall, but then he made a whole list of all the things I did wrong.
All
And
the anachronisms.
and yeah, and some of them were 100% legit, but the majority of it, probably 75% of it, was the use of language. And
Hmm.
I was like, you know what? I understand what you're saying, but at the same
Hmm.
time,
Most people aren't going to care, is the reality.
right, yeah, most people aren't going to care to a degree, and it's also like if it if it if it works with the romance of what you're trying to create,
Hmm.
then I don't worry about it a whole lot. Like I don't like, and I even wrote back to the guy. I said, look, I understand a lot of this, but I said, keep in mind, this is not historical fiction.
Hmm.
It's just fiction. And so it's like that allows me from a language standpoint to kind of do what I want with it. There's a writer named Wells Tower, and I think I mentioned this before, but there's a writer named Wells Tower who wrote a story. I think it's called Oh, Everything Something Everything Burned. And it is a Viking story and it's
Ooh.
great. It is a fantastic story, but it's written as if the characters almost talk like they do now.
Hmm.
And and it is so good. And I remember reading it and it was just kind of like a light bulb went off like, "Oh wow, like you can do this too." And and what I was telling the guy in the email is like, "Look, as I understand where you're coming from completely, but you also don't want to be that accurate. Nobody wants to read a Western written in 1830s English. You
True.
don't. You don't. I
Hmm.
mean, you wouldn't even understand half the stuff that's coming out of their mouths and the
Hmm.
slang and things like that.
Hmm.
You'd need a Western dictionary next to you to do that. So,
Even when we have things that are set in like the 1940s and they say the word Jerry's, that
mhm,
always throws me off because I'm like, half of the people that will read this will have zero clue
absolutely.
what they mean because it's a phrase from 1916.
Yeah. And if you're a writer like Cormac McCarthy or something like that, who has a kind of a carte blanche check to just, do whatever he wants. And he did difficult things like that. And part of his reasoning, what he actually said was, he said, I wanted the audience to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Which I get. I understand that. But at the same time, you're also making it more difficult for the reader. And, you know, all I'm saying is from a writing perspective, it's a choice, right? It's a
Hmm.
choice that you get to make. And I understand people who would like it, more in one way, but and a little bit like fantasy, right? We were talking fantasy earlier.
Hmm.
Obviously, you couldn't write a book of how they spoke in, the 11th century. I mean,
Hmm.
nobody would understand it.
Yeah.
Half of it would be Saxon French. I mean, so you have to just, you
Hmm.
have to have some malleability there, right?
Hmm.
I think. Yeah, I mean
No,
that would be
you're,
my argument anyway. But
I think that that's right. There is a level of, like, you can't expect people to know Elizabethan English.
Yeah.
is this simple reality. The point is telling a good story. Did you tell a good story? Did you tell a good yarn? Did you use language the best way to do that?
Hmm. I mean, Shakespeare was, and there's obviously so many theories on him and where
But
that's
he
from and all.
wrote
But
stories that were completely other time periods,
mhm,
Danish
mhm,
and
yeah,
ancient stories, and
yeah,
he used raw English of the time.
he did. And now when you read Shakespeare, probably 80 to 90% of the American public don't get about
Hmm.
three-quarters of the jokes that are in there because
Because they
they're
were
all
of
in
the
a
moment.
terminology that we don't use anymore.
Yeah.
So unless you have a reference or detail from that time period, you have no idea. And and
Hmm.
and a lot of it is so brilliant and so multi-layered and so much fun, but if you don't know it, you it all just, you know, which so anyways, writers out there, write it however you want.
That's the moral of the story. Write it the way you want it.
Exactly. Exactly. Keep in mind, I mean, we hear this all the time from the Tarantinos of the world and other directors, but it applies to writing just as much. And the whole thing is write a screenplay or make a film for you.
Hmm.
It's an audience of one, and it's for you. If you finish your project and you don't like it, that's a problem. But
Hmm.
but if you finish your project, whatever it is, and you do like it, then you have something to be proud of. If it doesn't latch on other places, oh well, so what?
Hmm.
But
I think one of my favorite things was write the book you want to read because you're going to read it a lot when you edit.
absolutely, absolutely. We, you know, editing is such a trip, man. You just, like you said, you just end up reading it over and over and over and over again. The Eagles, Don Henley, they asked him
Hmm.
a long time ago. I'm talking back in the early 80s or something, maybe early 90s. And they asked him what it took to be a touring musician. And his response was, you have to be very comfortable with repetition. And that's kind of what it feels like editing,
Hmm.
because you already know what you've written. You had to think it up. You had to edit it. You had to change it. You had to restructure it. You had to do all this stuff. And now you need to edit it again and again and again. And half the time you're a little sick of your own story by
Hmm.
the end of it. But you can still be kind of sick of it and proud of it, at the same time. Those things can work in concert. It's just yeah. It's it's not always the easiest.
I don't know if you feel this way. I don't want to sit down and like reread One Man's Treasure, which is not to say people should not read it and buy it and love it, but because I've read it enough. But like when I have friends, they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm at this chapter," and I'm like, "Oh, this chapter," and I read like the three lines, and I'm like, "Oh, that was good. That was really good."
Isn't that a trip when you can look back at your stuff? I mean, I've had numerous people over the years tell me that their favorite part of something was such and such. And a couple of times I've literally responded, I didn't write that. And then I'd look back and I did, and I'm like, oh shit, you know. But sometimes it is nice when you can look back on something and go, yeah, I really nailed that.
Mhm.
Regardless of what somebody else thinks of it, I did exactly what I wanted to there, and
Mhm.
and that's a good feeling. You know, that's a good feeling. So so the review six is coming up pretty soon here. Um,
I know.
are you gonna send in a submission for us?
I am. That is actually like my project in the next two
Oh.
weeks. I have sent out like you write the short story and you're like, I think that this is good. However, there's those two or three things I'm not certain. By the third draft, and you're like, other people feedback, get back. Be impressed I didn't send it to you for feedback. Hey, Brian, just randomly this short story. What do you think of it? I sent to other people, waiting for feedback and make a few adjustments. But it's that thing where I question how much do I want to work on it? Because
Hmm.
we've talked about this before. I'm not very fond of writing short stories. I think they're good exercises,
Hmm.
but I always feel like I'm either trying to make it too long
Hmm.
or I really hate writing anything more than I have to. So I would rather keep it the shortest thing possible. And the problem is then I write so tightly, I have to start putting air into it. This
Right.
book was originally like 10% shorter, and
Hmm.
I had to I've realized I need a little bit more gas in it, so I had to sit there with my pump, add
Sure.
more
Sure.
words.
Yeah. Yeah, I have the opposite. I have the opposite problem because I which is weird because I started out as a poet, right? So I try to be, especially with poetry, but I try to be as efficient with language as I can and get as much across with as few words
Hmm.
as possible. But I find it very hard, in particular with the Sunny stories, but very hard to write less than like a 25-page story.
Hmm.
Like how people write flash fiction, I have no idea. I have no idea. I can write poetry like that, but flash fiction, I don't get. I've never, I've even tried a couple of pieces and, I'm 5, 6 pages in going, well, I still have to resolve this. And I'm like, which is already way longer than flash fiction should be. So yeah, it's just one of those things where it's a struggle, for me personally. But we do here get a lot of stories that are sometimes, between like I want to say 4 and 8 pages, like somewhere in
Hmm.
there. And
Yeah.
we publish some of them too. I mean, the Charles Ardine one in here is great.
Hmm.
And and I think it's 5 pages, 5 or 6.
I think you do a great job keeping a good rhythm. Like we've talked about this before when you've been on Suit Up. The ability to take the review and stagger the stories so that they vary in length really does help bring the whole collection together. I've said it before, I think I've put it on my feed. I think review number 5 is your best one yet, so I'm very excited about 6. Whether I my story is in there or not, I know it's going to be a banger.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, but I really do take a lot of time. First off, selecting the stories with
Hmm.
with Jake, the associate editor, but then figuring out where they go. You know,
Hmm.
I almost always have what I know pretty early on what's going to be the first story. I know that.
Hmm.
Like I want something that just immediately gets you into the vibe that we're trying to set. But then after
Review
that,
number 1, quite the vibe.
you're right. Yeah. But then it kind of morphs over
Hmm.
time because after number one, it's kind of a free for all. I
Yeah.
usually end the issue with one of the longer pieces. I did in this
Yep.
one as well with with
Hmm.
with with Clicker Hill by
Hmm.
Eric O'Neill. But I so usually there's a couple longer pieces towards the end, but I do try to stagger it with regards to short story, long story, crime story, sci-fi story, western,
Hmm.
try to mix it in all the way through. And because we get the amount of crime we do, there usually ends up being 2 or 3 crime stories in a row sometimes. That's
Yeah.
can't do much about that. But yeah, I do spend a lot of time with that. I've told people this before, but I think I look at it kind of like putting an album together, you know,
Hmm.
and you want, certain songs at certain times. You don't want to have, and by that same token, you don't want to have a metal banger at number 4 and then a piano
Yeah.
ballad at number 5. You know what I mean? So you need to kind of take the reader down a notch before you get to
Hmm.
that ballad, if you will. So it really is a little bit of a science. So I appreciate the that. Um yeah, it's they in fact, anybody that's watching this later on, the submission period will probably be open by the
Hmm.
time this drops. So starlightpulp.com submissions should be open through our submittable page, and look forward to getting those stories. So yeah, so talk to me, Terrance, about what your next steps are. You've got these 2
Hmm.
rom-com novels, you've got this adventure novel. You said you're working on a story to submit, but like long term, like I'm talking 6 months down the road, year and a half down the road. What
Hmm.
kind of projects are you looking to get into?
I really want to write a traditional whodunit mystery. I've had a couple of an idea for one really been percolating for a while,
Oh,
and
cool.
so I might like I tried serializing on my website way back when, I hate writing routinely, so didn't happen. But I have like that seed of that idea I want to finish. Main thing that's probably going to be coming out the soonest is I'm going to write the sequel to One Man's
Oh,
Treasure
cool.
because I've gotten enough good feedback on it and I enjoy the characters, so I
Hmm.
want to write a sequel. I had an idea that I think is pretty decent for a follow-up, and then it's set up well for a sequel. And then I want to write a swashbuckling adventure story set during the Wars of the Roses. And that is the other thing that I'm okay. It's probably going to take multiple years just because of how slowly I write to get it done. But I think that it has the most interesting elements to me that I'd want to get right.
Interesting. Yeah, so talk to me about that process. I had here as one of my questions and I kind of skipped over it, but um every single writer, whether they admit it or not, has some kind of a process or a routine. Some
Hmm.
writers work very quickly and
Hmm.
some don't. Some struggle with ideas, but not necessarily the execution of the ideas once they have it. Others have, 25 ideas written down that they haven't even gotten to yet,
Hmm.
And so how do like I was talking with Manny the other day,
Hmm.
Manny Torres, who had the novella in American
Hmm.
Muse, which we put out in October, but he also has numerous books out on Outcast Press. And and Manny was talking to me about how I think he said he has somewhere like 4 or 5 unpublished novels just sitting around. And I'm like, dude, what? How do you? I mean, he's already put out, I want to say 3 or 4 novels in the last like three
Yeah.
years. Like, and this novella he just put out with us,
Hmm.
and now he has this whole, group of unpublished novels just sitting around. I am not like that. It doesn't
Yeah.
sound like you're like that.
No.
Yeah. So talk to me a little bit about your process and how that works.
So essentially, everything starts with a sentence, an idea, a phrase, a concept goes into my little notes app. From the notes app, then, as if anything, it's like gravity. The stronger the idea, the more stuff starts collecting around it. And so I will start then accumulating more information. And as I accumulate enough to get a premise from
Mhm.
the initial idea, then if I want to write it, I have found I didn't do this very well with some other stuff. And this is why I'm going back to it because it worked for the 2 romance novels and One Man's Treasure. I have just a notebook and I bullet point my outline and then I just start kind of writing longhand my outline, even if I don't know everything that's going to happen. I'm going to describe everything. I'm not going to write every line of dialogue. Writing that chapter, even if it's just this is the main conflict, this needs to happen, describe this thing. And then I take that. And then when I sit down to write in front of the computer, I'll
Mhm.
take my notes and basically draft the chapter. And then I'll probably do about 3 drafts
Mhm.
to turn it into something that I will then give to someone else to read and then start making the feedback from there.
Okay. And so when you sit down, are you a morning writer, a nighttime writer?
Whenever I can, honestly, it's
Okay.
been difficult to get back into the routine. This last year, I started a new job at the beginning of 2024. I got married in October, and
Congrats.
thank you. Uh, so life has just
Yeah,
adjusted and moved, and now I need to figure out how to
absolutely.
settle back into what is the creative process.
Hmm.
But I like to use my little notebook in the evening as ideas are coming to me, and then sketch it out. And then ideally, then the next morning, afternoon, I'm sitting down and actually writing out the thing on the laptop.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, what I tend to do is jot down ideas too. I have a
Hmm.
little folder on my computer. I've also got one on my phone where when something comes up, I just, you know,
Hmm.
oh, how about this for a scene? Or, see something where I'm like, oh, I got to do that at some point. Uh, and sometimes I'll look back at them and go, what the hell is that? You know, but other times there's some nuggets in there. Like I have one file on the computer where I've just randomly written about 3 or 4 Sunny scenes
Hmm.
that have nothing to do with anything. I don't know
Yeah,
the rest of the story. I don't know what
it's
they connected to. They're just
it's
these
like Robert
scenes
E.
where
Howard. Robert E. Howard said that he felt like he was more or less chronicling the. It wasn't that he was trying to start from one end to the other and telling Conan's stories. It's
Mhm.
as he understood Conan's stories and they came to him, he'd write them down, which is why they're not in chronological order at all.
Gotcha.
But that's what you're doing with Sunny.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, totally true. Uh, yeah, and so for the next story I'm going to write, actually, I have the half Pawnee, half Irish scout that I've been using, Rye
Hmm.
Lonehand. I've written a few stories with him,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and if you recall, he's in Days of Bone, Knights of Ash very
Hmm.
briefly. for like
Yes.
all of 2 or 3 pages. So the story I'm going to write is picking up right when he leaves there. So he will have
Mm-hmm.
just met with the characters in that story, and then at this point he's leaving the camp, if you recall, because the army unit or the cavalry unit is essentially going into a little suicide that he wants no part of, and he's already warned them about it,
Hmm.
and the captain's like, God will be on our side, and he's like, okay, well, I won't be. So, anyways, it's gonna pick up immediately after him leaving Asa and that band. So that's gonna be a lot of fun. But yeah, like I said, I'm on a slower side too, and it's interesting because when I write poetry, I'm not. I can just
Mm.
I can knock out. I mean, literally, there was a period, Terrence, in it was early
Hmm.
2000s, but I was not. I was writing so much. It was almost like a Bukowski kind of thing where I'd knock out like 5 to 7 poems a night, just and um and I'd write 5, 6 nights a week. Now, of course, a lot of them sucked, but anytime you
But
have that kind of
yeah,
output, some are going to suck. I mean, that.
exactly. And it's that's keeping the routine. Like
Mhm. Mhm.
realistically, this is something that I've made it kind of the decision for me is that I'm not really looking at my first 5, 6 novels as being the stuff that will potentially catch off because I'm very early in this.
Yeah,
Realistically, if I have a long career writing, my best stuff is ahead of me, and I'm okay with that.
yeah.
And I recently interviewed with Eric P. Bishop on the Suit Up podcast. That'll be coming
Mhm.
out in a couple weeks from now.
Cool.
The made a good comment about as a writer, you have to always kind of think that the next thing's going to be the best thing.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you get stuck in going, oh, but remember when I did really well doing that? I'm never going to top that. Oh no.
Yeah.
And so it's
You can't even
really,
think about that. Yeah.
yeah, no, everything. It's all you're rolling the dice.
Hmm.
You're saying this is going to be the next best thing.
Yeah.
It's the if you can make one heap of all your winnings and chance it all in one turn of pitch and toss, and so
Hmm.
lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word of your loss.
I like it. I like it. Okay, so thanks for checking in. Terrence, hang out with me for a sec. Thanks for checking in. This has been the Starlight Pulpcast. We've been talking about One Man's Treasure right here by Mr. Terrance Layhew. Go ahead and pick up a copy. Terrence, is there any one particular place you'd like them to go for this, or is it just anywhere?
Just Amazon. I mean, it's the place where everything goes.
Okay. And then this is our most recent book. Just came out in December. Starlight Pulp Review number 5. You already heard Terrence say he thinks it may be the best one yet. Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed putting it together. So you can get this at starlightpulp.com or any other online vendor. And thanks for checking in. Terrence, any last words?
It's always a pleasure.
All right. Thank you.
In this topsy turvy